The mothership was unlike anything Jake had ever seen or imagined. It moved through space like a living shadow, its form constantly shifting between dimensions in a way that made the sensors scream warnings and caused several Corvani technicians to look away from their displays. The creature was easily the size of Earth's moon, and Jake could feel its presence even through the shielding of the underground command center. All defensive platforms are powering up, Vextar reported, his voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in his large, dark eyes. But our weapons had no effect on the smaller creatures. I doubt they will do any better against something this size. Jake studied the approaching mothership on the main display, watching how it moved and trying to understand its behavior patterns. The creature was not charging directly toward the moon like the scouts had done. Instead, it was moving slowly and deliberately, examining the trapped scouts and the asteroid cage that held them. It is being careful, Jake observed. That means it learned something from what happened to its children. Nixara joined them at the tactical display, her face grim with determination. Our gravitational generators are already at maximum output. Holding the scouts. We cannot extend the containment field to include something that large. She looked at Jake with a mixture of hope and desperation. Do you have another plan? Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything he had learned, about predator behavior during his years in the Montana wilderness. The mothership was acting exactly like a parent animal whose offspring were in danger. It was cautious but determined, and it would not leave without either rescuing its young or destroying whatever had threatened them. I do have a plan, he said finally, but it is going to require everyone in this room to trust me completely, even when it looks like I am making the worst mistake of my life. The next hour was the most intense planning session Jake had ever been part of. His new plan was even more audacious than the first trap, relying on principles that seemed insane to the advanced Corvani, but made perfect sense to someone who had spent his life understanding how predators thought and acted. You want us to release the scouts, Quender said, his voice filled with disbelief. After everything we went through to catch them, you want to let them go? Not exactly, Jake replied, pointing to the tactical display. I want to make it look like we are releasing them while actually guiding them exactly where we want them to go. He turned to address the entire command center. The mothership came here to rescue its young. We are going to let it think it succeeded, and while it is focused on that rescue, we are going to spring the biggest trap anyone has ever attempted. Jake's plan required precise timing and coordination on a scale that pushed the Corvani technology to its limits. They would use the system's own star as the ultimate trap, creating a gravitational anomaly that would pull the mothership into the star's outer corona. The creature's own massive size would work against it, making it impossible to escape once it was caught in the star's gravitational well. But first, they had to get the mothership into position, and that meant convincing it to move closer to the star while chasing what it believed were its escaping offspring. Begin Phase 1, Jake ordered, and the Corvani technicians started implementing his plan with the precision of a military operation. The gravitational cage around the trapped scouts began to weaken in carefully controlled stages, making it appear as if their struggles were finally breaking them free. The mothership responded immediately, moving closer to provide support to the escaping scouts. Jake watched its approach with the focused intensity of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. Everything depended on the creature following its parental instincts instead of its caution. The scouts are breaking free of the containment field, Vextar reported. The mothership is accelerating toward their position. Perfect, Jake said. Now activate the herding protocols. All around the system, hidden gravitational generators began creating invisible barriers that would channel the mothership and its rescued offspring toward the star. To the creatures, it would feel like they were choosing their own escape route, but actually Jake was guiding them exactly where he wanted them to go. the mothership gathered its offspring around itself, like a protective parent, and began moving away from the moon base. Jake held his breath as he watched the massive creature's course, praying that his understanding of predator behavior would hold true, even for something from beyond the stars. The creatures moved directly into the gravitational channels Jake had prepared, following what appeared to be the safest route of the system. The mothership was so focused on protecting its young that it did not notice how the star's gravity was gradually taking hold of its massive form. "They are approaching the trigger point," Quendar announced, his voice tight with anticipation. Jake waited until the last possible moment, when the mothership was committed to its course and could not change direction quickly enough to escape. "Now," he said quietly, and Nixara gave the command that would either save her people or destroy them all. Hidden gravitational generators around the star activated simultaneously, creating an artificial gravity well that was perfectly positioned to catch the mothership. The creature realized too late what was happening as it found itself pulled inexorably toward the star's burning surface. The mothership fought against the gravitational trap with a fury that shook the entire system. Space itself seemed to ripple around the creature as it tried to phase out of normal dimensions, but Jake had anticipated this. The gravitational field was designed to work across multiple dimensions, preventing the creature from escaping the way it always had before. "The containment is holding," Vextar reported with amazement. "The creature is being pulled into the star's corona." Jake watched on the display as the mothership was slowly torn apart by forces that no living thing could resist. The star's gravity and radiation began breaking down the creature's interdimensional structure, reducing it to component particles that were absorbed into the stellar plasma. The smaller scouts, caught in the same gravitational field, suffered the same fate. When it was over, the Gethera system was quiet for the first time in weeks. The Devourers were gone, destroyed by the same stellar forces that had created life. In the galaxy, Jake felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he watched the last traces of the creatures disappear into the star. They had been terrifying predators, but they had also been parents protecting their young. "It is finished," Nixara sighed, her voice filled with wonder. "The Devourers are destroyed." But Jake knew that this was just the beginning. Word of the victory would spread throughout the galaxy, and other species that had been terrorized by the Devourers would want to know how a primitive human had accomplished what their advanced civilizations could not. Over the following months, Jake found himself traveling to dozens of worlds, teaching alien species the principles of hunting and trapping that his grandfather had taught him in the Montana wilderness. He worked with military leaders, scientists, and engineers, helping them understand how to think like both predator and prey. The Corvani established what they called the Trapline Protocol, a galaxy-wide network of early warning systems and defensive positions based on Jake's hunting philosophy. Other species contributed their own knowledge and resources, creating a defensive network that could protect entire sectors of space from threats like the Devours. Jake eventually returned to Earth, but he was no longer the isolated hermit who had lived alone in the Montana wilderness. His cabin became the center of a new kind of academy, where humans and aliens alike came to learn the ancient art of survival in a dangerous universe. On quiet mornings, Jake would still check his rabbit, snares, and cook simple breakfasts over his wood stove. But now his communicator would often chirp with reports from across the galaxy, telling him about successful hunts and trapped predators that had been stopped using techniques he had taught them as he sat on his porch watching the sunrise over the mountains. Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he heard his trap go off. He had thought he was catching breakfast, but instead he had caught the attention of an entire galaxy that desperately needed to remember how to survive. The universe was still a dangerous place filled with predators and threats. At most civilizations, could not imagine. But now there were hunters scattered across the stars, beings who understood that sometimes the most primitive knowledge was the most powerful tool of all. Jake Martinez had taught the galaxy how to hunt, and in doing so, he had made sure that no species would ever again face extinction at the hands of creatures like the Devours. His grandfather would have been proud. The first warning came from the outer sensor array at exactly 3 in the morning, Kethra time. Jake was sleeping in the small quarters that Corvani had given him when Quender burst through the door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled excitement and fear. "They are here," he said, his musical voice higher than usual. "The scouts have detected Devour energy signatures at the edge of the system." Jake rolled out of his bed and pulled on his boots, the same leather ones he had been wearing when this whole adventure started 2 weeks ago. He had insisted on keeping his original clothes, despite the Corvani offering him their advanced materials, claiming that his old gear was like a lucky charm. "How many?" he asked, as they hurried through the tunnels toward the command center. "Our sensors are having difficulty getting exact numbers because of their dimensional shifting," Quender replied, his long legs easily keeping pace with Jake's determined stride. "But the energy readings suggest at least 12 individual creatures, possibly more." He paused and looked at Jake with those large dark eyes that Jake had learned to read over the past weeks. "Jake, these are not the small scouts we expected. These are full-sized Devours, each one capable of draining the life from an entire city." The command center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Dozens of Corvani were working at their stations, monitoring the approaching threat and making final adjustments to the trap systems. The main display showed the edge of the Kethra system, where dark shapes were moving between the stars like shadows given form. Even through the sensors, the Devourers looked wrong somehow, as if they existed partially outside normal reality. Nixara stood in the center of it all, coordinating the defense with the calm authority that had kept her people alive through the destruction of their home world. When she saw Jake approaching, she gestured him over to the main tactical display. "Your trap is performing exactly as you predicted," she said, and Jake could hear the amazement in her voice. "The Devourers are following the energy trail we created and moving toward the inner system." Jake studied the display, watching the dark shapes as they flowed through space like a pack of wolves following a scent. They were not moving in a straight line toward the moon, which would have been the most direct approach. Instead, they were following the gravitational currents and energy signatures that Jake and the engineers had carefully placed throughout the system. "They are being cautious," he observed. "That is good. It means they are thinking like predators instead of just charging in blindly." Vextar joined them at the display, his face tense with concentration. "The first phase of the trap is working perfectly. They are avoiding the obvious defensive positions and taking the route that appears to offer the best cover." He pointed to the path the Devourers were following. "At their current speed, they will reach the trigger point in approximately 6 hours. Jake nodded and settled in to watch. This was always the hardest part of any hunt, the waiting and watching while your prey decided whether to take the bait. He had spent entire days motionless in hunting lines, waiting for deer to work up the courage to approach his carefully placed decoys. The scale was different here, but the principle was the same. Patience was the hunter's greatest tool. As the hours passed, Jake found himself thinking about all the traps he had set in his life. His first successful rabbit snare when he was 8 years old. The elaborate system of deadfalls and pit traps he had built to catch the bear that had been raiding his food cache 3 years ago. Even the simple rope snare that had caught the Corvani scout and started this entire adventure. Every trap was different, but they all relied on the same basic truth. Predators were predictable because they followed their instincts, and instincts could be used against them. The Devourers continued, their approach sometimes visible on the sensors, and sometimes phasing out of normal space entirely. Jake watched their movement patterns carefully, noting how they scouted ahead before committing to a course, and how they always kept escape routes open behind them. Smart, he murmured to Quender, who was monitoring the gravitational field. Generators. They are not going to be easy to fool. Is that a problem? Quender asked, his voice tight with worry. Not at all, Jake replied with a slight smile. Easy prey is boring. The smart ones are the ones worth catching. The first phase of the trap triggered exactly when Jake had calculated it would, as the Devourers moved past a cluster of asteroids that Jake had positioned near the fourth planet. Hidden sensors detected their presence and began broadcasting what appeared to be a distress signal from the moon base. The signal was designed to look like the Corvani had just noticed the approaching threat and were panicking. The effect on the Devourers was immediate. Their formation tightened, and their approach speed increased as they sensed easy prey ahead. They began moving more directly toward the moon, abandoning their careful scouting in favor of what looked like a quick strike against a helpless target. Phase 2, Jake called out to the command center, and dozens of Corvani began implementing the next stage of his plan. Throughout the system, carefully hidden projectors began creating false energy signatures that made it appear as if the moon's population was much larger than it actually was. At the same time, the real defensive platforms powered down, making the base look even more vulnerable. The Devourers took the bait completely. Jake watched on the main display as they abandoned all caution and began their final approach toward what they believed was a rich feeding ground defended only by primitive weapons. They moved in a loose formation that would allow them to surround the moon and begin feeding from multiple points simultaneously. Now, Jake said quietly, and Nixara gave the command that activated the trap's primary mechanism. All around the approaching Devourers, asteroids that had been drifting harmlessly through space suddenly began moving on new trajectories. Gravitational field generators that had been hidden inside these asteroids powered up simultaneously, creating an invisible web of force that surrounded the creatures. The Devourers tried to phase out of normal space, as they always did when threatened, but the gravitational fields prevented them from shifting dimensions. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a group of Devourers found themselves trapped in normal space with no way to escape. The creatures' reaction was immediate and terrifying. They began thrashing against the gravitational bonds, their forms flickering as they tried desperately to return to their natural dimensional state. Dark energy crackled around them like lightning, and their hunting calls changed to sounds of rage and confusion that made every Corvani in the command center cover their ears. The containment field is holding, Quender reported, his voice filled with disbelief. We actually caught them. But Jake was not celebrating yet. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any hunt was right after you caught your prey. Trapped animals fought hardest when they realized they could not escape, and he had a feeling that applied to interdimensional predators as well. How long can the gravitational generators maintain the field? He asked. At current power levels, perhaps 3 hours, Vextar replied. But if the Devourers continue to struggle like this, the generators may overload much sooner. Jake nodded. He had expected this. The first trap was just the beginning, designed to hold the creatures long enough to implement the second phase of his plan. Begin moving the asteroids into final position, he ordered. It is time to close the cage. The next few minutes were the most tense of Jake's life. All around the trapped Devourers, the asteroids began moving inward, guided by their hidden gravitational generators. The creatures realized what was happening and fought even harder against their bonds. But the trap was closing faster than they could break free. As the asteroid cage contracted around them, something unexpected happened. The largest of the Devourers A creature that dwarfed the others suddenly let out a call that seemed to echo across dimensions. Jake felt the sound in his bones, a vibration that spoke of ancient hunger and cosmic rage. "What was that?" Nixara asked. Her face pale with concern. Jake studied the readings on the display and felt his stomach drop. The creature had not just called out in anger. It had sent a distress signal, and something much larger was responding. "We caught the scouts," he said quietly, "but the real hunters are coming." On the edge of the sensor array, a new contact appeared. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the creatures they had just trapped. The mothership had arrived, and Jake realized that his trap had just become bait for something far more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. But as he watched the enormous creature begin its approach toward their system, Jake felt this familiar calm that always came over him when facing a truly challenging hunt. He had built his trap well, and now it was time to find out if a Montana trapper could catch the biggest predator in the galaxy. The moon of Kethra Prime looked like a giant gray rock floating in space. But as their ship got closer, Jake could see lights scattered across its surface, like stars that had fallen from the sky. The Corvani had built their refugee settlement inside the moon itself, carving out huge caverns and connecting them with tunnels that stretched for miles underground. Jake watched through the ship's viewing port as they descended toward what looked like a crack in the moon's surface, but turned out to be a massive hangar bay. Thousands of Corvani were waiting inside the hangar when their ship landed. Jake had never seen so many aliens in one place, and the sight made him realize just how desperate their situation must be. These people had lost everything and were living like refugees in caves, hoping that somehow a human from Montana could help them survive against creatures that had already destroyed their entire civilization. Vextar led Jake through crowds of curious Corvani who stared at him with their large, dark eyes. Some of them reached out to touch his clothing or his skin, as if they could not believe he was real. Children who looked like smaller versions of the adults followed behind them, chattering in their musical language and pointing at Jake's boots and his knife. They walked through tunnels carved from solid rock until they reached what Jake assumed was the command center. The room was enormous, with curved walls that showed images of space in all directions. Hundreds of Corvani were working at stations that looked like they were grown from crystal rather than built from metal. In the center of the room stood the tallest Corvani Jake had seen yet, a being who radiated authority, even though she looked as tired and worried as everyone else. "This is High Counselor Nixara," Zaralin said as they approached. "She leads what remains of our people." Nixara was even more impressive up close, with intricate patterns carved into her pale gray skin and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. When she spoke, her voice was deeper than the others and carried a weight that made Jake stand up straighter. "So you are the human who catches things without hurting them," she said, studying Jake carefully. "Vextar tells me you believe the Devourers can be trapped like common animals." There was skepticism in her voice, but also hope that she was trying hard not to show. Jake nodded. "Every predator follows patterns, even ones from other dimensions. The trick is figuring out what those patterns are and how to use them." He looked around the command center at all the advanced technology and the worried faces of the Corvani. "But first, I need to understand what resources you have and what kind of space we are working with." Nixara gestured to the walls around them, and the images changed to show a map of the solar system they were in. Jake could see several planets and moons, along with asteroid belts and what looked like the paths of comets and other space debris. "This is the Kethra system," she explained. "We chose it because it is isolated and has few life-bearing worlds that would attract the Devourers." Jake studied the map carefully, his mind already beginning to work on the problem. "How long before they find you here?" he asked. "Our scouts estimate 3 weeks, maybe 4, Vextar replied. They are moving through the systems between here and our home world, consuming everything in their path. He pointed to areas on the map that were marked in red. These worlds have already fallen. The Devourers are following a fairly direct path toward us. That is good, Jake said, and several Corvani made sounds of surprise. If they are following a predictable path, it means they are not just wandering randomly. They have a plan, which means they have intelligence, which means they can be outsmarted. He moved closer to the map and began pointing to different locations. What I need to know is whether you can move large objects in space and whether you have any way to hide the energy signatures of this moon. Nixara looked intrigued. We have gravitational manipulators that can move asteroids and small moons. And yes, we can mask our energy output, though not indefinitely. She paused and studied Jake's face. What are you thinking? Jake smiled for the first time since he had been captured that morning. I am thinking about the biggest trap anyone has ever built. He turned to address the entire command center, and his voice carried clearly through the large room. The Devourers hunt by sensing life force, right? And they prefer easy targets with lots of food in one place? That is correct, Zarelin confirmed. Then we are going to give them exactly what they want, Jake said. We are going to make this system look like the most tempting target they have ever seen. And when they come to feed, we are going to spring a trap that will catch every single one of them. The room fell silent as the Corvani processed what Jake was suggesting. Finally, a young engineer named Quender spoke up from one of the workstations. You want to use ourselves as bait? Not exactly, Jake replied. I want to use the idea of yourselves as bait. There is a difference between being prey and acting like prey. He moved to the center of the room and began gesturing as he explained his plan. In my world, we have animals called coyotes that are very smart and very dangerous. You cannot catch them with a simple trap because they are too clever. So instead, you make them think they have found something weak and helpless. And while they are focused on that, you spring your real trap from a direction they never expected. Jake worked with the Corvani engineers for the next several days, translating his hunting knowledge into technology they could understand and build. The plan he developed was complex, but based on simple principles that any human hunter would recognize. They would use the gravitational manipulators to move asteroids and small moons into specific positions throughout the system, creating what looked like natural hiding places, but were actually components of a massive trap. The key was making the trap look organic rather than artificial. Jake insisted that they use natural materials wherever possible and avoid the kind of high-tech solutions that the Corvani usually preferred. The Devourers have probably seen every kind of advanced weapon and defense system in the galaxy, he explained to Quender, who had become his primary collaborator. But they have never seen a trap built by someone who learned to hunt from his grandfather in the Montana wilderness. Quender was fascinated by Jake's approach to problem-solving. The young Corvani had been trained as an engineer and was used to thinking in terms of complex mathematical equations and computer simulations. Jake's methods seemed almost primitive by comparison, but they had a logic that Quender was beginning to appreciate. You do not calculate the exact trajectory of your prey, Quender observed one day as they worked on the trap's trigger mechanism. You simply put the trap where you know the prey will eventually go. Exactly, Jake said. Predators are predictable because they follow their instincts. The Devourers might be from another dimension, but they still think like hunters. They look for the easiest target. They approach from the direction that gives them the best advantage, and they always try to escape the same way they came in. He pointed to the holographic display showing their trap design. We are going to use all of those instincts against them. The trap itself was elegant in its simplicity. When the Devourers arrived in the system, they would see what appeared to be a heavily populated moon protected only by a few small defensive platforms. The life force readings would be enormous, suggesting a rich feeding opportunity. As they moved in to attack, they would trigger the first part of the trap, which would channel them into a specific approach vector. Once they were committed to that approach, hidden gravitational generators would activate, creating a field that would prevent the Devourers from phasing out of normal space. At the same time, the asteroids that had been positioned throughout the system would begin moving on predetermined courses, creating a three-dimensional cage that would contract around the trapped creatures. The beauty of it, Jake explained to Nixara during one of their planning sessions, is that the Devourers will not realize they are trapped until it is too late. They will think they are making all the choices, following their own hunting instincts. But actually, we will be guiding them exactly where we want them to go. Nixara nodded slowly, beginning to understand the elegance of Jake's approach. It is like herding animals, but on a cosmic scale. That is exactly what it is, Jake confirmed. My grandfather used to say that the best way to catch a smart predator is to make it think it is catching you. As the days passed and the trap neared completion, Jake found himself thinking about his quiet cabin back on Earth and wondering if he would ever see it again. But when he looked around at the faces of the Corvani, especially the children who had never known any home except this underground refuge, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The Devourers had destroyed one civilization already, and Jake was determined not to let them destroy another. The trap was almost ready, and according to the scouts, the Devourers would arrive within days. Jake checked and rechecked every component, making sure that everything would work exactly as planned. He had built many traps in his life, but never one where the survival of 50,000 refugees depended on his understanding of predator behavior. Soon they would find out if a simple hunting philosophy from Earth could defeat creatures from beyond the stars. Jake found himself standing inside the alien ship within minutes of agreeing to come with them. The beam of light had lifted him up like an invisible elevator, and now he was in what looked like the inside of a giant pearl. The walls curved smoothly around him and glowed with soft white light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The floor felt solid under his boots, but looked like it was made of the same flowing silver material as the outside of the ship Vexstar was still holding. The crystal creature, which Jake now realized was probably their version of a scout or messenger. The being made gentle sounds to the creature and placed it in what looked like a medical bay built into the wall. Machines that Jake could not understand began scanning the creature with beams of colored light while Vexstar watched the results. On a screen that appeared in the air like a hologram, the female being approached Jake and touched a device on her wrist. Suddenly, Jake could understand what she was saying, though her voice still had that musical quality he had noticed before. "I am Zaralyn," she said, "and I must thank you for catching our scout so carefully. We have been searching for 3 days and feared it was lost forever." Jake looked around the ship and tried to process what was happening to him. Just an hour ago, he had been planning to cook rabbit for breakfast, and now he was talking to aliens who could translate languages instantly and travel through space in ships that defied everything he knew about physics. "How does this translation thing work?" he asked, pointing to the device on Zaralyn's wrist. "It reads the electrical patterns in your brain and matches them to known concepts," she explained. "Your species has a very straightforward way of thinking that makes translation easier than with most civilizations we have encountered." She paused and looked at Jake with what seemed like curiosity. "Tell me, how did you know to make the rope? Loose enough that our scout could breathe, but tight enough that it could not escape?" Jake shrugged. "Same way you catch any small animal without hurting it. You got to think like the thing you are trying to catch. Your scout was scared and confused, so it was not going to fight the rope. It just needed to feel secure until help arrived." He looked at the crystal creature, which was now resting comfortably in what looked like a healing chamber. My grandfather taught me that the best traps work with nature, not against it. Vexstar finished checking on the scout and joined their conversation. Your grandfather was wise, he said through the translator. We have traveled to many worlds and met many species, but few understand the balance between capture and care the way you do. His large dark eyes focused on Jake with an intensity that made Jake feel like he was being studied. This is why we hope you will help us with a much larger problem. The ship began moving, though Jake could not feel any sensation of motion. Through what he assumed was a window, though it looked more like a hole in the wall, Jake could see the earth falling away below them. His stomach lurched a little as he realized he was leaving the planet, but he forced himself to stay calm. These beings had not hurt him so far, and they seemed to need his help with something important. Where are we going? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. To the moon of Kethra Prime, Zaralyn replied. It is where our people have taken refuge while we try to find a solution to our problem. She gestured to another area of the ship, and Jake followed her to what looked like a meeting room. The walls here showed images of space, with stars and planets slowly rotating around them. What I am about to show you may be difficult to understand, but I need you to see what we are facing. The images on the walls changed to show what looked like a peaceful planet covered in blue oceans and green continents. Cities sparkled on the surface like jewels, and Jake could see ships moving between the planet and several moons. This was our home world, Corvani Prime, Vexstar said, his voice heavy with sadness. 10 million of our people live there in harmony for over 1,000 years. The image changed again, and Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. Dark shapes were moving through space toward the planet, shapes that seemed to bend light around them and made Jake's eyes hurt to look it directly. As the shapes got closer to the planet, the cities began to go dark one by one. These are the Devourers, Zaralyn said quietly. They consume everything, not just the plants and animals and people, but the very life force of entire worlds. Jake watched in horror as the beautiful planet became a dead gray ball floating in space. The Devourers had somehow drained all the color and life from it in what looked like just a few hours. How many people got away? He asked. 50,000, Vexstar replied, out of 10 million. We barely had time to evacuate a few ships before they finished feeding. The images showed the Corvani ships fleeing through space, while the Devourers continued their work on the planet. This was 6 months ago. Since then, they have consumed 12 other worlds and are moving in our direction. Jake studied the images of the Devourers more carefully, trying to understand what he was seeing. The creatures seemed to exist partially, outside normal space, flickering in and out of visibility like shadows. They moved in groups, but not in any organized formation, more like a pack of wolves following different scents. Have you tried to fight them? He asked. Our weapons pass through them, Zaralyn said. Our shields cannot stop them. They seem to exist in our dimension and others at the same time, which makes them nearly impossible to target. She brought up new images showing Corvani warships firing energy weapons at the creatures. The beams went right through the Devourers, as if they were not there. We have lost 17 ships trying to engage them in battle. Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand why they had brought him here. But you were able to study them enough to learn how they hunt. Yes, Vexstar said, looking surprised that Jake had grasped this so quickly. They are attracted to large concentrations of life force. They can sense populated worlds from great distances and always move toward the largest available food source. He paused and looked at Jake intently. This is what we hope you can help us understand. How does a predator think? How can we use their hunting instincts against them? Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what he had learned. These advanced beings with their incredible technology were being hunted by creatures they could not fight or understand. But to Jake, the devourers sounded like any other predator he had dealt with in the wilderness. They had patterns, preferences, and most importantly, they could be fooled. Every predator has weaknesses, Jake said finally. The key is understanding what they want and how they go about getting it. He pointed to the images of the devourers. These things hunt in packs, which means they communicate somehow. They prefer easy targets, which means they can be scared off if you make yourself look dangerous enough. And they follow their stomachs, which means you can lead them where you want them to go if you know how to bait them properly. Zarlin and Vextar exchanged glances, and Jake could see excitement in their large eyes. You think they can be trapped, Zarlin said. It was not a question. Everything can be trapped if you understand it well enough, Jake replied. The question is whether you folks are willing to think like prey for a while in order to catch a predator. He looked out at the stars flowing past the ship. In my experience, the best way to catch something that thinks it is the top of the food chain is to make it believe it has found the perfect victim. The ship continued through space toward the Corvani refuge, carrying Jake toward what would either be the greatest hunt of his life or the last mistake he would ever make. But as he studied the images of the devourers and began to understand their behavior patterns, Jake felt the familiar excitement he always got when he was preparing to set a truly challenging trap. These creatures might be from another dimension, but they were still predators. And Jake Martinez had been dealing with predators his entire life. The only difference was that this time, the survival of an entire civilization might depend on his ability to think like both hunter and prey at the same time. Jake Martinez rolled out of his sleeping bag when he heard the familiar snap of wood hitting wood. The sound came from somewhere near the creek behind his cabin, right where he had set up his rabbit snare the night before. He stretched his arms and cracked his neck, feeling the cold Montana morning air bite at his skin through the open window. Winter was coming early this year, and he needed to stock up on meat before the heavy snows made hunting impossible. He pulled on his worn leather boots and grabbed his hunting knife from the table beside his bed. The cabin was small and simple, just one room with everything he needed to survive in the wilderness. Jake had been living alone here for 3 years now, ever since he quit his job teaching survival skills to city folks who thought they could learn everything from books and videos. Out here, miles from the nearest road, he could live the way humans were meant to live, using their hands and their brains to survive. The morning sun was just starting to peek through the tall pine trees. As Jake walked toward the creek, his breath made small clouds in the cold air, and his boots crunched on the frost-covered leaves. He could already smell breakfast cooking, or at least he hoped he could. The snare had definitely caught something, but sometimes it was just a stick, or a rock that had rolled into the trigger mechanism dot. As he got closer to the creek, Jake noticed something strange. The area around his snare was glowing with a soft blue light, like someone had dropped a handful of fireflies on the ground. He stopped walking and pulled out his knife, holding it ready. In 3 years of living in these woods, he had never seen anything like this. The glow was too steady to be fireflies, and too bright to be mushrooms. Jake moved forward slowly, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. His grandfather had taught him to hunt when he was just 7 years old, and the first lesson was always the same. When something seems wrong, it probably is wrong, so move like your life depends on it. The blue glow got brighter as he approached the snare, and he could see that something was definitely caught in the rope loop he had tied between 2 saplings. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The thing in his snare was about the size of a rabbit, but it looked like it was made of living crystal. Its body had 6 legs and what looked like 4 eyes, each one glowing with the same blue light he had seen from a distance. The creature was not struggling against the rope, just hanging there and making a soft humming sound that reminded Jake of a tuning fork. Jake had seen a lot of strange things in the wilderness over the years. He had found bear tracks that were bigger than dinner plates, and had once watched a mountain lion stalk an elk for 3 hours without making a sound. But this thing in his snare was definitely not from around here. It looked like something from one of those science fiction movies his sister used to watch when they were kids. The creature turned its 4 eyes toward Jake, and the humming sound got louder. Jake could see now that what he had thought was crystal was actually some kind of shell or armor, and there were tiny lights blinking underneath it, like a computer circuit board. The rope of his snare had caught the creature around what might have been its neck, but it did not seem to be hurt or even scared. Jake was still trying to figure out what to do when the entire forest went silent. No birds singing, no wind in the trees, no sound of water running in the creek. Even the insects stopped buzzing. The only sound was the humming from the crystal creature and the beating of Jake's own heart. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to know that when everything goes quiet like that, something big is about to happen. The silence lasted for maybe 30 seconds, and then Jake heard a new sound that made his stomach drop. It was like the sound of a jet engine, but deeper and more powerful. The sound was coming from above the trees, getting louder every second. Jake looked up through the pine branches and saw something that made him forget all about breakfast. A huge metal shape was floating above the forest, blocking out the morning sun. It was bigger than any airplane Jake had ever seen, maybe 3 times the size of a football field. The surface of the thing was smooth and silver, with no visible engines or wings. It just hung there in the sky, like it weighed nothing at all. Lights were blinking along its edges, and Jake could feel a vibration in his chest, like standing too close to a bass speaker at a rock concert. The crystal creature in his snare started humming louder, and the lights under its shell began flashing in a pattern. Jake realized that the thing was trying to communicate with whatever was in that flying machine. He was holding an alien in his rabbit snare, and its friends had come looking for it. Jake's first instinct was to run back to his cabin and grab his rifle, but he forced himself to stay calm. His grandfather had always told him that panic was the enemy of survival. When you find yourself in a situation you do not understand, the smart thing to do is watch and learn before you act. So Jake stayed where he was, keeping his knife ready, but not making any threatening moves toward the creature. A beam of light suddenly shot down from the flying machine and hit the ground, about 50 feet from where Jake was standing. The light was so bright that Jake had to close his eyes and look away. When he opened them again, 3 figures were standing in the beam of light. As the light faded, Jake could see that they were definitely not human. The 3 beings were tall and thin, maybe 7 feet high, but built like basketball players. Their skin was pale gray and seemed to shimmer in the morning light. They had large heads with huge dark eyes and long fingers that moved like water when they gestured to each other. They were wearing what looked like uniforms made of the same silver material as their ship. One of them stepped forward and raised its hand toward Jake. When it spoke, the words came out in a language that sounded like music mixed with the sound of wind chimes. Jake could not understand what it was saying, but he could tell from the tone that it was not threatening. The being seemed to be asking a question. Jake pointed toward his snare, and the crystal creature caught in it. All 3 of the tall beings turned to look, and he could see relief in their large dark eyes. One of them made a sound that might have been laughter, and they began talking to each other in their musical language. The one who had spoken first approached Jake slowly, keeping its hands visible and moving in a way that reminded Jake of how he approached wild animals that might be scared. The being stopped about 10 feet away from Jake and pointed to itself, then made a sound that sounded like Vex Tar. It was telling Jake its name. Jake pointed to himself and said, "Jake," as clearly as he could. The being repeated Jake back to him, and its pronunciation was almost perfect. Vexstar pointed toward the snare and made a questioning sound. Jake understood that it wanted to know if the crystal creature was hurt. Jake walked over to his snare and carefully examined the rope around the creature's neck. The loop had tightened when the creature was caught, but the rope was not cutting into its shell, and it seemed to be breathing normally. Jake looked back at Vexstar and shook his head, then pointed to the creature and gave a thumbs-up sign. He hoped that thumbs up meant the same thing to aliens as it did to humans. Vexstar made what sounded like a sigh of relief and said something to the other two beings. They walked over to the snare and began examining it closely, pointing at the rope and talking excitedly among themselves. One of them, a female-looking being with slightly smaller features, approached Jake and began making gestures with her hands. She pointed to the snare, then to her head, then made a motion like she was thinking very hard. Jake realized she was trying to tell him that they were impressed with his trap. These advanced beings with their flying machine and their technology were impressed with a simple rope snare that any human hunter could make. Vexstar carefully untied the rope around the crystal creature's neck and lifted it gently in his long fingers. The creature stopped humming and its lights stopped flashing, but it seemed unhurt. Vexstar held it close to his chest and made soft sounds, like a parent comforting a scared child. The female being was still studying Jake's snare, running her fingers along the rope and examining the trigger mechanism he had carved from a piece of wood. She looked up at Jake and made a sound that was definitely admiration. She pointed to the snare, and to Jake, and to her ship in the sky. Jake was pretty sure she was asking him to come with them. Jake looked at his simple rope trap, then at the massive alien ship floating above the trees, then at the three beings who seemed as curious about him as he was about them. His quiet morning of checking snares had turned into something that would change his life forever. But as he stood there in the Montana wilderness, holding his hunting knife and looking at creatures from another world, Jake realized that this was still just another kind of hunting. These beings needed his help with something, and his trap had caught their attention in a way that their advanced technology could not. He nodded to Vexstar and pointed toward the ship if aliens needed help from a human trapper. Jake Martinez was ready to find out why.